All right, Nick, back on the show again. Welcome. And you were in Washington, D.C. yesterday for the latest congressional hearing. First of all, how's things with you?
It's great, Vinnie. Thanks as always for having me on. And yeah, I was actually in DC both the night before the hearing. I got down the day earlier. Met up with a number of people. Was hanging out with Lester Nare and Ronak Patel of UAP Caucus. Lester announced that he's now actually in an operations role with the UAP Disclosure Fund. Got together with a bunch of those people and other folks that people who follow this topic will be familiar with the night before, and then the day of the hearing and some after events. So yeah, it was kind of another full set of activities of UAP persuasion in Washington, D.C. And thankfully, I'm just out here in Baltimore, which for people who don't know is like a $9 commuter train outside of Washington. So very easy to get down there for me. And that was really convenient and great.
Excellent. One thing, I kept up throughout the day and early in the morning at people that were, at the event queuing up. And it seemed, there was a lot of buzz around it. Um, but people were queuing up like almost through the night, some almost guarantee themselves
Literally.
a place. Yeah. I mean, that's crazy. What was the atmosphere like then when you sort of arrived on location?
Yeah, no. So I made the decision. I was really, I was in the hearing room at last year's July hearing with Grush, Fravor, and Graves. Got to do my photo bombing of Fravor while he's giving the Tic Tac testimony. So I wasn't quite as personally driven to be in the hearing room itself, knowing that they have an overflow room just upstairs with video feeds, and a lot of people are accommodated there who can't make it into the hearing room. And so I kind of went and showed up with a mind towards just getting into the overflow room, which had ample room. Frankly, everyone was able to be accommodated who even showed up if they were happy going up there. And that was kind of a group experience as well. So I got there, a little later in the morning. There was already probably a good 80 plus, 90, even maybe 100 people lined up. A little bit of almost a carnival atmosphere in the hallways of Congress. This is at the Rayburn House Office Building. It's one of the three big office buildings right off of the mall on Capitol Hill, right near the Capitol, that the House side of the U.S. Congress utilizes. Senate is on the north side of Capitol Hill. So I got there and there was already, this long line down the hallway. That's not really necessarily how typical DC hearings work. You don't necessarily garner a whole bunch of interest from the public. And I think, people sort of knew from last year's hearing, oh, this is something I can show up to. This is something I can be part of, not just view through a screen, but be part of the actual experience. And I've been encouraging people do that. I mean, even if you don't make it into the hearing room and you're sitting in the overflow room, those optics are really, really good for this topic in DC, because you get all of these other Congress people just walking down the hallway. You have all their staffers. They're noticing that, like, holy cow, what's this? Like, this doesn't normally happen every day, especially as we're getting towards the holiday season. Why are there like 100 members, or even, grew to more members of the public showing up for something? And they're like, it's a UAP hearing again. They keep showing up in serious numbers for these UFO hearings. So I think that's a really great thing, and for people to continue to do, is these hearings are available to us. So, it was a long line. It's funny because, having gone to the July hearing last year, I know so many more of the people who were there now than I did even a little over a year ago. And it's great to be able to reacquaint with all of those folks, kind of understand where people sort of fit into the UAP interest ecosystem. You see all sorts of stuff. I mean, old school activists like Danny Sheehan and Steve Bassett, who, again, I kind of knew glancingly last year, but, become more acquainted with in the last year since then. So, and then just so many other people from the internet, people in the communities who follow this topic, other types of activists, people from other organizations, journalists who follow it, the Matt Fords and et cetera. And so it's just this real coming together around these kind of very tangible examples of kind of legislative and governmental progress, or something that sort of signifies progress, something that looks like people are taking this seriously, like serious people are addressing this in the way that we address all the other topics of concern in our world and society. So Kind of like last year again, very kind of exuberant. People are very excited about it. They really wanted to show up to support Lou, support Admiral Gallaudet, the Michael Gold. I think a lot of people were kind of curious what he was going to say and contribute. I knew a little bit more about him, just a tad from his experience on the NASA UAP independent study team. I had a feeling he would speak to that, and he kind of came from that angle. And then, of course, Michael Schellenberger, who's known for this Immaculate Constellation document, although we've actually learned even really in just the last day that Jeremy Corbell seems to have had a significant role in getting those materials out and into the hands of Congress. So a little bit of a group effort, which is always cool. And so we obviously heard from him on that. And so people wanted to support this ongoing process, these witnesses, make sure that people like Lou know that the public is behind what he's done, what he continues to do. Obviously, a lot of people have been saying we really want to get Lou on the record, under oath, hand in the air, and then saying the kinds of things that he's been talking about for, gosh, what, 7 years now almost. So it was a great opportunity, and I think people wanted to be part of the history that represented, to kind of finally get that testimony locked in, knowing that this is a guy who takes governmental service really seriously. He obviously is a man who takes his oaths very seriously. He's gone out of his way not to reveal classified information, to be very specific about how he dodges around things. And so when someone like him, who has a demonstrated track record of taking oaths seriously, goes under that oath in such a formal environment, the wood panels, the congressional hearing room, everyone's kind of quiet and serious. Once they get in that room, it becomes this very kind of serious affair, and people are really taking it, quite seriously. It really says something when someone like him is in that particular kind of environment and then says, what elements of his own story and experience around the topic were. So it really quite fascinating experience, just again to be part of the unfolding of this from kind of a governmental history perspective.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost feel the atmosphere even through the screen watching it live on YouTube. You could see that, so that was really good. But out of the members of the House that were there, and the Congress men and women asking questions, in your activism efforts, had you spoken, or what relationship had you had to them previously, or members of their staff?
Yeah. So most of my relationships with the Congress that I've been forging, really over putting more emphasis into that in the last several months, and over the course of this year, planning the Hill Day that I did with UAP Caucus and some of their other activists who came in, and we met with a bunch of congressional offices back in November. I'm sorry, back in October, September. Sorry, it's so much is getting compressed. Mid-September now. The last couple of months have just flown by. So we've really been putting our focus on developing relationships with the staffers most specifically, because staffers are really who do a lot of the stuff in congressional offices. And so a number of those offices that had an actual presence of their members at the hearing, we have been in touch with to various degrees. And so it was great to see, I think, a set of fairly well-informed questions. We can get a little more into the specifics, but there was, because there was kind of different classes of testimony on display across those four witnesses. You kind of had the two governmental guys, Lou and Admiral Gallaudet, who had kind of some of their own experiences, come from positions of stature within government on specifically the defense and intelligence side of the realm. And then you had kind of a science advocate in Michael Gold, with his NASA affiliations and career and kind of that kind of stuff. And then, of course, kind of the more like, the slightly muckraking journalist who's uncovered something a little salacious. So questions fell into a variety of different camps. And for people who don't know about how these hearings take place, 5 minutes is sort of the magic number. 5 minutes is sort of what people are given to give opening statements. 5 minutes worth of questions, 5 minutes worth of responses. And so, everything kind of has to get very compressed because of that format. Now, granted, it was almost a 2.5 hour hearing, so there was a number of opportunities to revisit topics and things like that. But it kind of gets a little broken apart and sometimes even a little discordant because, one rep might be asking questions of all four witnesses that are kind of very different sets of questions that might relate to their individual experiences, their specific testimony, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's like one moment they're quickly trying to get out one question to one guy and get a response on the record, and then it's like a completely different set of questions for the next person they want to ask some questions of. So I think they really did as well as they could given the variety of testimony that took place. Obviously what Schellenberger was talking about, he was the only one who was sort of presenting from the position of himself as a kind of an independent media person, a set of allegations that weren't something he was immediately privy to, right? It was some unnamed source who was conveyed this, both through maybe Jeremy and himself, and they've done a little cross correlation and they feel good about the source, but it's kind of like a new set of information. And so some of those questions, I think, we're trying to get to the meat of how firm some of those allegations around, say the immediate Immaculate Constellation program or alleged program is, whereas other questions were like much more focused on what someone specifically experienced themselves. So I think they did pretty well with that. There were four witnesses. Last time in July of 23, we had three witnesses. So it was, inherently a little more, piecemeal and broken apart in that way. But I think, what they're demonstrating is that they continue to be pretty well informed. Unfortunately, there was a couple of House members who weren't present at this hearing who were present in July 23. And that included like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Jamie Raskin, who's an important member of the House Oversight Committee. And it was kind of a busy day on the Hill. There were votes going on, and so members were having to kind of like run around, and even Rep. Oh my gosh, I'm having a brain fart. One of the reps, and in fact, I'm not even necessarily remembering which one it was, but it had mentioned that like the governor of his state had been, and he had just had to meet with him, and he ran upstairs.
Was that Garcia?
Yes, it was Robert Garcia. Thank you. So, one of them, caught up at the very last moment. He had been out of most of the hearing. This was Andy Ogles, I believe. And then he kind of like ran in at the last moment and got the last set of questions in. So that's sort of normal, like on a busy day on Capitol Hill. But I would have liked to see, more members there. It was still, I think, more leaning on the Republican side. There were obviously some key Democrats involved, like Garcia and Moskowitz. But we want to continue to see this be very bipartisan and have all sorts of representatives representing all different types of Americans engaged with the topic. But again, I think was an effective way of sort of sealing the case. Like the way I was describing it to people is it felt like the case has now been officially made, especially with someone like Lou and Admiral Gallaudet kind of putting their testimony on the record and getting to face direct questions from Congress in a public setting. We can say like Congress has been told what the allegations are, and that includes by some very credentialed and just well-respected members of military and intelligence community. So what I will be looking for moving forward is both maybe more even congressional engagement with more reps taking an interest in the topic and making sure they're showing up to these types of events with well-informed questions. And also that moving forward, instead of just kind of re-articulating a case that I think has now been made quite effectively, at least from a like, you really need to look into this. I think what was kind of clear, and even some of the reps spoke to this, is like, they need help understanding how to do the digging that's now required to really uncover the type of information that both they're interested in and the constituents that they represent are interested in. Like they need guidance. One other thing I'll mention is a few of the questions that came up from House members clearly were informed by things that people have come to them and alleged. Some of these even got a little out there. I think it was maybe Representative Luna who brought up something that it sounded like someone had brought up to her that involved, again, this is going a little bit into the woo territory. I don't, take a stance on it necessarily just because I don't have evidence one way or the other. But like the US government has, been testing, some kind of hybridization of our own soldiers using some kind of extraterrestrial or non-human DNA to create some kind of universal soldier, super soldier type thing. And it's like, I can't vouch for that. That obviously is pretty far out compared to other types of allegations relating more specifically to UFOs themselves and the types of occurrences that people have around those. And to me, it's like they're clearly getting bombarded by many different sources of information telling them many different types of things, including some that are quite salacious like that. And I don't know, like they clearly still need help to be able to sort of filter these allegations, prioritize them, understand which ones probably have a little more merit or at least are worthy of more immediate investigation because they're a little more understandable, or that seems like it might be more achievable. So, now I think people like myself, many of the other advocates, some of these witnesses themselves are going to have to just continue in a very, day to day, real world, making phone calls, having meetings, having email exchanges, set of communications with these offices to continue to help guide them in the pursuit of more open knowledge around this topic. I was talking with a staffer for a senator, probably about a week ago, via email. We have kind of semi-regular exchanges. He's made himself very available, and it's a senator who's quite tied to this topic. And he had to remind me, Nick, you have many years of interest and knowledge around this topic. Assume that some staffers like myself might not have as rich a knowledge base around this, even though I help my senator with defense issues and other things. Like UAP still is pretty new to a lot of these folks. It's not something they necessarily ran into in their professional career dealing even with defense issues. So we're having to kind of, even explain acronyms that you and I might throw around, like the UAP task force or this or that, or AOMSIG, there's so many, right? It's governmental and military. So of course there's a lot of jargon. And we're even having to kind of educate some of these people about that jargon so they know what we're even talking about when we talk about the UAPTF from 2020 and some recent, intelligence assessment that's been declassified that we want them to look into. So, that education of our own representatives is kind of what lobbying often comes down to. People associate it with like, yeah, I'm going to fund you and move money around, and it's kind of, sketchy as all heck. And there is that element of some lobbying activities, especially when you're representing major corporations or major groups or major unions or whatever it might be. There's the mechanics of that, but lobbying can also be this completely grassroots kind of activity. Members of the public lobby when they engage with their representatives and try to kind of tell them about things and educate a staffer about something. And we're just going to have to kind of be in the trenches, continuing to do that kind of lobbying to make sure we're building up, a useful knowledge base in these representatives' minds about this topic so they know really where to focus. Because, as you know better than anyone, Vinny, with this topic in particular, so little of a tangible nature is really known from like a firm evidentiary perspective. And given what we're talking about, the possibilities are kind of like anything you could ever imagine. Theoretically, that chasm that is like so wide, that gulf of what's known and what's possible, you can fill it up with so many different types of things. Misinformation can emerge in it, just things that get confused or incorrect, but not necessarily deliberate disinformation. But then again, lots of deliberate disinformation can get seeded into that chasm as well. And so there is so much to navigate. And a congressman can ask a question about like the government trying to hybridize soldiers with alien DNA. And maybe that's going on. I haven't seen evidence of anything like that. But like they don't necessarily know if that is more or less credible than other types of allegations that get made. So, the education, this is why I think a number of people say this is a marathon. Senator Rounds actually said this at the UAP Disclosure Fund event that took place later in the day after the hearing. He said, he reminded the attendees, this really is a marathon. And part of that is just, we need to ramp up some of these people's knowledge base so they can be more effective from an investigation standpoint. So that's clearly happening. I think it lends the notion to people who are enthusiastic about this topic. You don't think you're running a sprint when everyone is trying to tell you this is a marathon. We have to have, a willingness to, and it's been 80 years since the Foo Fighters of World War II. Yeah, this is coming up on a century now, right? So, some people, not everyone, some people act like, oh, we didn't get everything we wanted out of this hearing. Disclosure hasn't happened. I'm getting bored of this, or I'm over it, or I'm just, so frustrated by the pace, especially after so many decades, which makes sense. I'm like kind of almost ready to throw in the towel. And, I think it's good for people to take breaks at times and, come back to it a little bit later. But other people might just have to realize, let's say there is a theoretical 3 to 5 year trajectory. We need to really chart out specifically, what do we think is achievable in that time frame, given so much education needs to take place still around this, so much like deep investigation needs to take place. What are our priorities as a community, as people who are interested in the UAP topic? What do we think is more achievable? What's a good set of tactics to follow as this unfolds over the years in the political realm? Because it really is progress. Like many other pet issues that many people care about in this world don't have any congressional hearings. They definitely don't have like annual congressional hearings or several sets of congressional hearings a year between the House and the Senate, plus year after year after year of legislation and official government reports on whatever topic they're interested in. Some movements, it can be decades and decades, absolutely, before they get to that point. And the nice thing is that UFOs is there now, but it means now there's a sort of a new timetable to those sets of actions and tactics unfolding. And I encourage people to be willing. What year are we even in now? I can never even remember. It's the end of 2024, which sounds crazy. Like we finally live in the future, right? Um, and maybe one of those signposts of living in the future is like there's congressional UFO hearings like after all of these years. But like let's think about like what can we do between now and even 2030? We have what's that 5 year window look like? There's, I think, a lot that can continue to be accomplished, and if we're willing to sort of attack it in that more marathon way, knowing that there's going to be years still of this happening, I think we will actually get more done, because we can kind of put together cohesive strategies with specific sets of tactics that take into account the realities of issues unfolding in Washington on those types of timeframes once you kind of get a certain coalesced level of interest by a number of representatives across the House and the Senate, say. So I actually feel pretty good, but I know I want to see future hearings. For instance, like bring in current intelligence officials and present them with some of these allegations and use some of their own statements, and bring them up. Bring in, DNI Haynes. Granted, she might not be the DNI for much longer, and there's going to be a lot of turnover in government over the coming months with the new administration coming in. But, bring up what the last 3 DNIs have said. These are the people who ostensibly run the intelligence community. The last 3 have said some kind of far out stuff about UFOs that says they're real. They do things we simply do not understand in certain cases. It's very difficult to kind of even understand how it's possible for some of these observations, like what could possibly be behind this. And that they seem open-minded to some pretty interesting possibilities for what this could represent. But that has never really been said in such a formal setting, right? It's like, I'd love to see someone of that stature come in, be brought in by Congress, asked, this is what these statements have said. in this official capacity, you have taken an oath. Can you reiterate this in a very clear fashion so Americans on the record understand where the intelligence community is at, and especially thinking about these true outliers among the UFO cases that they have? And I think that's a pretty achievable goal in the relative short term, to get something pretty eyebrow raising on the record under oath, even if it's just sort of reiterating what we've heard on a number of occasions from high level officials. Get, as Lou, put his hand up and in that setting got on the record. Let's get to that phase with people who are currently part of the intelligence community, and that to me would represent a major next step in the kind of disclosure process.
Yeah, I felt where with some of Lou's answers to the questions that were directed at him, the way he was kind of answering felt almost like a continuation of what David Grush was saying. So it did feel like that's where the progress may come from more often. But then, do you think waiting 15 and a half months between hearings is a good thing? It almost seems like we could lose momentum. We almost need them on a biannually kind of level, let's say. Do you think that would be better? Because there were so many broad ranges of things asked. It almost feels like now it needs to they really need to hone in on where to look. And Burleson said it when he brought up, we need your help to kind of know where to go. And so it almost feels like with the crash retrieval legacy program thing being almost at the top of this pyramid of importance right now, maybe the focus should shift into one direction and then they go at it, as a collective rather than being so broad. What do you think?
So I think one thing people need to bear in mind about hearings like this, you're right that it's useful from kind of a public awareness perspective, but the hearing is not really the investigation. In some ways, it's political theater, and not in necessarily a bad way. It's a very public expression of something that's been going on. And so we have to remember that all of these other months of the year, there's things going on. There's conversations. There's witnesses coming forward and speaking with Congress. There's legislation being drafted and negotiated. There's new government reports from aero offices that they need to dive into. There's new declassifications that are occurring, like the ones that Navy has put out over the last several weeks now relating to the UAP task force. So there's always other stuff going on. And it's actually kind of useful for the topic to have that breathing room, in my opinion, to let those other kind of tangible activities occur. Because by the time you're seeing it at a hearing, it's not necessarily some brand new, major step in an investigation that's occurring in that several-hour window. It's almost like to wrap up what's been going on in the months and months and months beforehand, and then take a breath, and then chart out what the coming period of activity is going to look like. So I actually wouldn't necessarily say more hearings would necessarily be useful. It's we need to make sure lots of more useful things are occurring throughout the year. And I think a lot of us have a sense of what those activities are that we've sort of queued up both individually and as organizations and as allied organizations. We kind of know what we're trying to get accomplished over the next 9 months before maybe we get another House hearing or something like that. There's been some talk of kind of field hearings, which are a little less formal, and they might not even be officially supported, in certain ways, and some House members say might show up somewhere and kind of almost do like a little bit more of a press event type thing, and that might serve its purpose. But again, it's important to remember that too is a little bit more theatrical in a sense. It's about creating a set of optics. A word you hear a lot in DC is optics. What does the look of a situation intone to both those in Washington, the public at large, could be everyone else, the DoD, defense contractors, you name it. And we can't get overly focused on things that are there to establish optics. They're good, but as I was saying, they're kind of mile markers more than tangible events in and of themselves that move things forward. So I actually think the tempo is really good. If we can keep this kind of tempo going, but actually make sure that if there is another House hearing, in the autumn of next year, they now have a number of other very tangible things that have happened in the months since, that can kind of be a wrap up of.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Now, I'd just like to focus a bit on Michael Schellenberger and the Immaculate Constellation. We had the document put into the congressional record almost at the very start, which we've learned came from Jeremy Corbell. Now, it seems to me like questioning around that, because Schellenberger did not want to talk too much about his sources, which you can understand from a journalist. Any good journalist, yeah, will protect their sources. But it feels like, and a lot of people have said to me today, did they all have a closed hearing afterwards and that, and which I don't think was the case. But I've heard that potentially some of the witnesses did meet with individual members and that. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, that's my sense as well. I understood there were some closed conversations that took place. I don't know for sure myself whether those were even in the type of environments that would allow certain types of information to be relayed. People talk about SCIFs, these special facilities where you can have classified information, conversations, media, whatever it is. It needs to be in these very tightly controlled environments, obviously, because you're dealing with heavily classified information potentially. But that's just part of it. On some level, you also need the people, the witnesses who are making allegations, to have even current, clearances that allow them to talk about certain things. I'm not personally aware of what level of clearance various individuals associated with this do or do not currently hold. So even in a closed environment, and even if it's a SCIF, whether they as an individual are authorized to discuss certain things under any circumstances is just another layer of the complication of trying to get at something that is so secret. And this seems to be one of the most secret topics in government. So, but one hopes that again, certain things get conveyed in those settings, and again, all throughout the year as well, because we know that some of these witnesses and such are talking to Congress throughout the year and having those kinds of meetings throughout the year. So one hopes that they are getting armed with particular nuggets of information that allow them to achieve again this kind of tangible investigatory steps, when we aren't really paying attention to what's going on. So some things could come up there that could push this along. The Immaculate Constellation stuff is fascinating. Um, I believe some folks have put in requests to DoD and the government now, and like the official response is that they can find no record of a program called Immaculate Constellation. And one of the things you've probably heard me talk about online, Immaculate Constellation, frankly, is just a lot of syllables for how a lot of classified programs tend to be named. It also refers to a constellation, which has certain implications, maybe satellites or stuff like that. And usually a program name doesn't have something so obvious in it, especially if it's highly classified, that even would imply what it's about. So yeah, I have questions myself about like, what does that phrase even mean? Was it a program? Was it a capability? Was it kind of a set of technologies and approaches? Was it an operation that was to gather information on the UAP topic? So it's hard to know quite what to do with that, especially if having the name, which is really the main thing that came out of that, with some very brief descriptions of what it was there to do. But if you kind of have the name and you put the name out there and you dig and the name doesn't get you much back, then you don't really have a ton to work with at that point. So we'll see if Immaculate Constellation and those documents and some of the specific allegations bears much fruit. But as we've talked about, and I talk about online, that was supposedly a program that was stood up in 2017 to kind of consolidate certain sets of UAP activities. I think Schellenberger said it was kind of a DoD program, yet kind of managed by the White House. That certainly seems possible. We know that a little more recently, like Biden had talked about after the February 23 UAP shootdowns over North America, putting together a White House kind of task force on this That was not the same as some of the other task forces on the topic. So could that have happened also earlier and they actually did it as a classified program at one point? It's all very possible. But the thing I come back to is, around that time frame, we know what ended up becoming what we now know was first called the Interagency Task Force, that sort of evolved into the UAP Task Force, which was this cross-agency, like broad effort, in government to kind of consolidate UAP data, analyze it, work with partners across the federal government, and even including educators and private corporations. I mean, it was a somewhat whole of government type effort. That was all coming together not very long after this 2017 date. We have documents now from 2019 that show that interagency task force had already kind of come together and was doing work and was successfully consolidating UAP data from a variety of sensor systems, maybe not satellites, maybe a lot of it was kind of more aircraft based and FLIR and radar, but we know they were successfully getting UAP data. And a number of people at UAPTF have said they don't really know much about Immaculate Constellation. It doesn't sound like it's ringing bells to them. So I just have to wonder what the relationship of these programs could have been. And that might be something to dig on. But the UAP task force itself, now that we have a handful of their classified reports that have been put out heavily redacted, that's something very tangible that people can dig on. Congress members can go after those documents, try to peel back the layers with the access that they have of those black redaction marks. And I was really glad to see Schellenberger literally wave some of those UAPTF reports around and call attention to the fact that 2 out of 3 possibilities for UAP are classified still, and almost every page is completely blacked out, and even basic images that a lot of people seem to think can be scrubbed in a way that would make them suitable for public consumption and not give away national security secrets. He also called attention to that. That was great. And that might, like, we have the documents. They're just, they're heavily classified still. So I would not want to see necessarily those types of tangibles get ignored by chasing, a name that may or may not bear results when we have something right in front of us. And I was, again, glad that Schellenberger kind of brought all of that together in his conversation and made sure he wasn't, I think, overly focused just on the Immaculate Constellation stuff, but like, we also have this other stuff, and you guys really need to start getting to the bottom of it and share more of this stuff with the American public.
Yeah. So to briefly summarize your main sort of takeaway from the hearing, but also within that, could you kind of give us a message to the people who have an interest in the UFO subject, who will watch a hearing like that? And I've seen a lot of these reactions today is, we learned absolutely nothing more. We haven't moved forward one little bit.
Yeah, no, we have. Like, my takeaway is, if Congress members are putting their bandwidth, their energy, their political capital as individuals, as representatives, as personalities, into this topic in a repeated way, and they signify that they're taking it really seriously, and I think every congressperson clearly was taking it quite seriously. I believe that across party, across ideology, it's people continue to reiterate. It's wonderful that the parties are treating this in kind of just a nonpartisan fashion. It's not really a partisan issue at the end of the day, and so we almost have a rare opportunity in DC to like not be thinking about party and ideology, and it's really keeping focused on a very specific issue. That is progress. I mean, we had decades and decades and decades where there weren't these kind of hearings at all. It's not, again, not there necessarily to chart whole new territory in a 2.5 hour window. It's to kind of wrap up and present a lot of what's been going on in the last year, even several years worth of investigation. So I would advise people not to expect shockers. People were like, do you think there's going to be a surprise witness? And I told them, no, I don't think there will be a surprise witness, because this isn't like it's not a made for TV event. It's not like a gotcha, or, the doors thrown open and suddenly like, oh my God, Carl Nell just walked into the room. And that's just not really how this stuff works. And so we have to have our expectations, a little bit reserved. And again, for anyone who is motivated to do so, to network, to work together, and to try to fill the rest of the year up with tangible activities. So when the next hearing happens, and it is a wrap up of stuff that's occurred beforehand, it is at least progress from the last hearing. And again, as I said, I think this hearing sealed the case. Like, it's been presented, the allegations are out there, including like allegations of more secret programs like an Immaculate Constellation, or who knows however many secret UFO programs there are across government across the decades. It could be a lot of things like that. And if you follow this issue every other day or every day, or you're kind of living it, or you're very involved with it, it's going to be tough to feel super impressed necessarily, because you probably have a pretty good bead on a lot of what's going to come up at the hearing already. But I encourage people to do whatever you can. If you're a US voter, engage with your representatives. It's little things. I had a great chat with someone, I think it was in the hallway waiting to get into the hearing, where we were talking about, like, people just need to make the phone calls and talk and ask a few questions, like like basic things, like, can you tell me who the staff member is of my representative who might help them with defense issues or science issues? It's getting people educated about what committees their representatives are on, both on the House and Senate side. So you kind of know, because everything in DC is really very oriented around committees, because Congress is a big thing, and committees are more focused on specific topic areas. And then there's subcommittees, which are even more focused. So people have to put that energy into figuring out, here's my reps, these are the committees they're on, these are the subcommittees they're on. Like, you could have a rep who is on some, air travel safety subcommittee. Well, wait a minute, that's a relevant topic to UAP. All these people are talking about it in those terms, air safety, and you've got Ryan Graves and the Americans for Safe Aerospace Act. And, okay, my rep clearly has some role in, investigating air safety issues. They might not be a rep who's really associated with the UAP broadly, but I can ask who's the staffer who helps them with that committee work, and develop a relationship and get their email address and send them documents when a new UAP task force document is declassified, and say, this is presenting a safety of flight issue, and I really want to make sure you realize that as a constituent, I want you to be engaged with this topic. So, people should not be overly frustrated because not a whole lot of whole new stuff came up. But I think it will be fair, especially now, and again, especially as it sort of feels like the case has been made, to have some pretty good expectations in place for next year, and then do what we all can do to see those expectations actually unfold.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I think overall it was a positive for sure, and I appreciate you kind of breaking it down there for us. But let's move on to a couple of other events. One that I really want to touch upon, which is the UAP Disclosure Fund event that took place after. But before that, you attended the gathering with the New Paradigm Institute and MUFON. So if you could just briefly just give us a short overview on that.
Absolutely. So pretty much right after the hearing wrapped, there's a little park right to the south of the House Rayburn building. And New Paradigm Institute and MUFON got together and held this little rally. It was probably about 40, 50 people or so. And they announced sort of a partnership. It had been mentioned in the past, but they really kind of more formally announced a partnership between MUFON and New Paradigm Institute. I don't know quite what to make of that at this point. I'm not going to try to drag anyone over the coals, but I think there's a number of folks who've expressed various concerns about MUFON. And, New Paradigm, they are what they are. I think people know Danny and the people associated with that, and kind of what their vibe is and what they speak to, and sort of what the universe of issues that they are paying attention to. And some of it gets a little further out. And MUFON, I think, I have my own concerns about how their database kind of seems like it got transferred to OSAP. And that might not have been a really totally cool thing to have happened. Again, there's still like not a lot of information, but DIA getting a hold of a database of public UAP incidents and even encounters and who knows what else, it just raises my eyebrow. I mean, remember, people got freaked out about the NSA having phone call metadata, because that's ostensibly a DoD intelligence operation that's supposed to be focusing on foreign powers and things like that. So for the Defense Intelligence Agency and one of their contractors to get a MUFON database, and it like remains a little bit like of a murky area how that actually transpired, even though it was spoken about directly in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. So these people are acknowledging that it happened. Um, I don't know. I think people just need to be very aware of that and question, do we want to see that kind of thing continue to happen? People had always sort of made allegations that some of these UAP reporting organizations and their databases might be a front end to government gathering information on this topic. That kind of validated that concern is a legitimate one. If people are submitting reports and they don't want it to just go straight to the US intelligence community. So I'm going to be kind of remaining open-minded, but also just very aware of what that relationship between their organizations continues to grow into. But it was good to continue to see from their angles, beating the drum on this topic, and many of the individuals involved in both NPI and MUFON have been at this for a really long time, and I think that they all do take it really seriously. So that was just sort of like about a 30-40 minute gathering, had a number of different speakers, members of the public were there, and that was good to see, just kind of some continued momentum. And then, as you mentioned, we'll talk about there was also an event a little later in the evening that the UAPDF put on.
So yeah, so it was really good today when I opened X and I saw some images and a short video from the UAP DF event, seeing Rounds, talking, and a photo with Rounds and Lou. So that was really good. So I know Lestanare kind of was in part in his new role something to do with organizing that. So tell us what that was actually set up to achieve.
Yeah, I think several things. First of all, to kind of bring together, some just really grounded people who have been tied to this topic over the last number of years. Again, both folks like Lou Elizondo and Tim Gallaudet was there as well. Several Congress members were there, not only Senator Rounds, but you also had Rep. Burleson and Rep. Burchett were there. And then a lot of, again, really serious-minded journalists, activists. I don't want to out people who were there, but a lot of I use this term wonky, like kind of nerdy, intelligent folks who treat this issue as sort of a policy issue. It was kind of like a policy event. The room was at one of the Senate buildings. They have some event spaces in them, and those actually have to be reserved by a member of the Senate. And Senator Rounds and his staff locked in that space for the UAP Disclosure Fund. I saw one of Rounds' staffers who I know there and said hi. And they were involved in kind of making that happen and getting the space. So again, that signifies that Rounds continues to just be supportive of this. He had a very eloquent little statement that he made. They and just again reiterated many of these issues. It is a marathon. He's obviously fully committed to just continuing this work. He presented Lou. This was really special. I don't think anyone, including Lou, was expecting it. Just kind of in recognition for Lou's work. This large framed red line version of the FY or the UAP Disclosure Act of 23, the original version of it from last year. Framed, it was the redlined version, just to signify, and I mean, this is a good point, to signify the work that Lou Elizondo put into that legislation. And Rounds kind of made this clear. Lou has been talking with Congress, not just at this hearing, throughout the year, helping educate them on the topic, helping point them in the direction, like where to look for more useful information, what type of stuff in legislation would be useful to have in there as it relates to this. And we have to remember that it's not just, again, the on video hearings or TV interviews or whatever. Like, people are doing real things throughout the rest of the year that aren't just quite as visible, but are, as meaningful, if not more meaningful than those very visible things. Again, good to see a couple of the House members who are clearly still interested in this issue, who were present at yesterday's hearing, be willing to mix with people in that kind of an environment. I got to talk to Eric Burleson a little bit. They continue to seem to be pretty fired up. I think they're frustrated with how stymied they are by DOD and the intelligence community and even the executive branch broadly. But again, they're putting their time and energy into, making sure that people have access to them, can talk to them, can bounce ideas off of them, can thank them, can, we rake them over the coals if there's something about them. I mean, we have to have opportunities to interface with such people, and the UAP Disclosure Fund event really gave us that. Again, it was just really nice to see a lot of the very serious-minded members of the community come together. If you saw some of the video from it, Ronak Patel, who works with Lester through UAP Caucus, was volunteering some of his time and energy to make sure that event was captured. And again, a lot of other people were involved in putting that on. It was a very kind of serious event, like very professional, I guess is how I would put it. It felt like going to a little event, if you go to an industry conference on something and, you go to someone's little mixer afterwards, and it was just really serious minded. Leslie Kane and others were there. So, a lot of people have kind of put blood, sweat, and tears into this topic. It was like an opportunity to get together. And from a networking perspective, and I don't want to underemphasize this, even giving people and kind of useful people the opportunity to get to know one another and network and exchange information and just get to know one another a little better, not through a screen, but shaking hands. I've talked with Matt Pines, just for an example, plenty online through X and other things on, X Spaces. I've been on Matt Ford's show before, but I got to meet these guys in person and shake hands and have a drink or whatever. And that's actually really a useful part of movement building as well. Again, I think back to July 26th last year and not knowing anyone in the line or a few people. And then now this year, it's a lot more people know each other and have been talking and kind of, that gets stuff done. It might sound like whatever, you can send an email or whatever, but no, building relationships. When I was in business, building relationships is a huge, huge percentage of how you get stuff done, how you close deals. And making progress on UFOs is a deal we have to close, so to speak, or a series of deals we have to close. So I think, having you on and the guys at UAP Disclosure Fund and their amazing board of advisors, get people together in that circumstance is really useful. And, I just want to say this too. Mike Rounds he just puts off this vibe that I don't know, it's a very kind of almost chemistry thing, but I really like his vibe. He's very down to earth. He's from South Dakota. He represents a variety of types of people in South Dakota, because we have to remember there's indigenous populations. When you go into Rounds' office, there's all of these flags from some of the different tribes and stuff like that. I mean, so he represents, all those types of people as well amongst his constituents. And you just get this really reasonable, down-to-earth human vibe. He's got this calm but charismatic attitude, and to know that he is the main name this year on the UAP Disclosure Act. And he actually spoke to that a little bit in his statement. It was interesting. This is a message a number of us have been trying to convey to both his office and others. That review board for UAP records and making sure that they have subpoena power and kind of carte blanche clearances to do more digging for UAP records across the federal government. He seems to have focused on that as the next main legislative priority. So if we had all of the stuff that the original UAP Disclosure Act had in it, and we got this sort of National Archives records collection established last year, it seems like the next main checkbox for him is that review board. And I fully agree that should be the next checkbox that they go to try to get. So he spoke to that continuing to be a priority. Unclear if we'll actually see that pass in this year's NDAA, but he seems to still be focusing on that and wanting to make it happen. So, just a great opportunity, hear a few words from Lou and the others. It just a great way of bringing people together that, again, it's an important part of movement building to allow people to kind of develop those interpersonal, relationships and coalitions.
Yeah, and I'm going to cut this bit out of me speaking now. I'm actually, I think we should just leave the Arrow report bit out. I think I might record a show over the weekend, which you're very welcome to join me on, just a bit more of an overview. Um, well, Nick, that's great. Thank you so much. That sounded like a really important event as well. I always appreciate your time, coming on here and kind of giving your viewpoint, especially when you're able to get to these events that like a lot of us just have to watch through the screen. And I hope one day I'm able to make it out there to attend as well. But
We'd love to have you, Vinny. I think you would really get a kick out of it.
oh, absolutely, indeed. But yeah, thank you so much. And I think it was a successful day overall. And I hope to everyone out there that you don't allow your frustrations because you don't maybe get all the answers that you want initially to kind of knock you in any way, because we're still moving forward in my eyes. And I think a lot of people will agree with that.
We deserve the answers, Vinny. And so I am very sympathetic to people who really want them and feel that they're well overdue at this point. But this is real progress still. And I think it means we're getting closer to that point.
Absolutely. Nick, thank you so much. And for everyone watching, thank you as always. Please remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and by all means, leave any comments and opinions in the comments below.